Hello everyone and welcome back to Fibromyalgia Fighter. It's me, Jamie, and this is going to be part one of the mini-series, and this one is What is Fibromyalgia? So part one of this mini-series is going to be all about just what fibromyalgia is. It's not going to be specifically about symptoms, about diagnosis, treatments, any of that kind of thing. It's just going to focus on what fibromyalgia actually is. Now, you're going to see over the first few slides that I'm going to take you through that it's complex and very difficult to characterize, and you're going to see exactly what I mean by that. But over the next few slides, we've got 8 different sources that I've taken the direct description of fibromyalgia from, and you're going to get some idea of what exactly fibromyalgia is. But if we take you to the first slide, so fibromyalgia may also be referred to as FM. A lot of my friends, a lot of my work colleagues refer to it as FM because fibromyalgia, for a lot of people, if they're not saying it particularly often, is difficult to remember and can be difficult to say. It can also be referred to as fibromyalgia syndrome or FMS. Now, the first source we've got for a description of what fibromyalgia is from the NHS UK, which is the National Health Service in the UK. They provide all of our free healthcare treatment, and their direct definition is fibromyalgia, also called fibromyalgia syndrome, FMS, is a long-term condition that causes pain all over the body. Fairly straightforward description of what fibromyalgia is from the NHS there. Next, we've got the CDC, which is the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Fibromyalgia is a condition that causes pain all over the body, also referred to as widespread pain, sleep problems, fatigue, and often emotional and mental distress. So as you can see, similar to the NHS UK, but they've expanded upon it by giving a couple of other difficulties that fibromyalgia sufferers contend with alongside the pain. So they've mentioned the pain, but they've added to it and suggested that it's not just about pain, it's about other things as well. And we're going to see a common theme here as we go through the next few slides. So moving on, we have got Mayo Clinic, and their direct definition is fibromyalgia is a disorder characterized by widespread musculoskeletal pain accompanied by fatigue, sleep, memory, and mood issues. So theirs is, I would suggest, they've gone slightly more in depth than either of the previous two, I would say, but whilst the initial part is extremely medical, characterized by widespread musculoskeletal pain, which sounds very medical. They've then said mood issues at the end, which made me smile when I read it, because I thought they've started off by being very medical and then they've literally said mood issues, which for me isn't a particularly medical term. Everyone has mood issues, right? Everyone gets in a bad mood from time to time. I would say that's part of being human, not particularly part of being someone who suffers from fibromyalgia. However, we will come on to that a little bit later, because it is more common for people who have fibromyalgia to have mood issues. Moving on, we have got rheumatology.org, who have defined fibromyalgia as fibromyalgia is characterized by widespread pain and tenderness, sensitivity to touch. So very similar to the NHS UK, except they've also mentioned that fibromyalgia sufferers can be sensitive to the touch of their body, which no other definition, as far as I can remember, has done so far. and it's a very valid point. It's another thing that is an issue for fibromyalgia sufferers. If you saw my previous video on my story, you will have seen the diagrams about tender points. I'm going to put them back on the screen right now so you can have a quick look if you haven't seen them. But basically these are points at which fibromyalgia sufferers can suffer quite large amounts of pain if we are touched in those areas. Certainly if there is any pressure applied to those areas, they can hurt quite a lot. Moving on, we've got Wikipedia. Now, I know Wikipedia is not a medical source by any means, but they've actually got a really broad page on fibromyalgia on Wikipedia. I was quite impressed reading through it. I'm not verifying the authenticity or the accuracy of the information on their Wikipedia page, but there was quite a lot of information, so it was a fairly good source. So I've taken the definition. And they have stated fibromyalgia FM is a medical condition defined by the presence of chronic widespread pain, fatigue, waking unfreshed, cognitive symptoms, lower abdominal pain or cramps, and depression. Now, all of these so far have mentioned pain, which is primarily what fibromyalgia is all about. And a large majority of them have also mentioned fatigue, again, part of what fibromyalgia is all about. Wikipedia, however, have taken the next step by talking about sleep, which other organisations or companies that we have already seen the definition of have mentioned sleep, but waking unfreshed is a big one. And we will come on to that when we have part 2 of the mini-series, which is going to be all about symptoms. But I was rather impressed that they'd mentioned this, because none of the others had up until this point. They just mentioned sleep issues. So next we have the National Institute of Arthritis and Musculoskeletal and Skin Diseases. They've got a rather large definition. So they have said that fibromyalgia is a chronic, long-lasting disorder that causes pain and tenderness throughout the body, as well as fatigue and trouble sleeping. Scientists do not fully understand what causes it, but people with the disorder have a heightened sensitivity to pain. I think that's a relatively good description, if I'm being perfectly honest. It's not perfect, none of these ever will be. That's a personal opinion, because obviously for some people that description may well be perfect. On a personal level, I don't think any definition is ever going to be completely perfect. But that was a pretty good one, I thought, because they've mentioned fatigue, trouble sleeping, they've mentioned the pain and the tenderness, all of that kind of thing, which are the main focal points, in my personal opinion, for fibromyalgia. So I was quite impressed with that. If we look on the left-hand side, I have had to alter the theme of the PowerPoint ever so slightly because Healthline didn't really have a very great copy and paste facility, so I've just taken a screenshot from their website directly. So Healthline have defined fibromyalgia as a long-term or chronic condition causing symptoms such as musculoskeletal pain or pain in the muscles and bones, tenderness, general fatigue, sleep, and cognitive disturbances. Again, I think that's a relatively good way of putting it. Obviously, they've bullet pointed it, which isn't a bad idea when it comes to fibromyalgia, if I'm being completely honest. So again, pretty impressed with that definition. And finally, we have got medical news today. They have defined fibromyalgia as fibromyalgia is a common chronic syndrome that can cause widespread body pain, fatigue, and cognitive issues. A person may confuse fibromyalgia symptoms with those of arthritis or joint inflammation. Now, this is an interesting one. So they've mentioned the pain, they've mentioned the fatigue, they've mentioned cognitive issues, which only one other source had previously. They've gone a step further by adding that fibromyalgia, or people with fibromyalgia symptoms, may have similar symptoms to people with other conditions, such as arthritis or joint inflammation, and that's part of the reason why it can be so hard to get a diagnosis for fibromyalgia. Now, in the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about what fibromyalgia can sometimes be confused with, what it can be misdiagnosed as, which are also things that have to be ruled out before you can be diagnosed as having fibromyalgia. But what I'm going to do first is just summarise all of those 8 sources. So what we can gain from having gone through 8 different sources, from varying different sources as well, is that there's a general widespread agreement that fibromyalgia is about chronic pain and fatigue. There's not a general agreement on how to classify fibromyalgia. It's referred to as fibromyalgia or fibromyalgia syndrome. Some people refer to it as a disease. I don't like it when people refer to it as a disease because it's not classified as a disease. I would beg to differ that it's classified as a syndrome. Personally, I only ever use the word condition because condition for me is a more generalized term, and for me fibromyalgia is yet to be classified as anything because scientists, people in medicine, they're still not really sure what fibromyalgia even is. We've obviously got all of these different definitions, but as you can see, the definitions have differed between every single source. There's a general agreement of the widespread pain, the fatigue. Some of them have mentioned cognitive issues. Some of them have mentioned sleep issues. Some of them have mentioned, or one of them I think mentioned, gastrointestinal issues. All of these are symptoms of fibromyalgia, but not everybody suffers from the same symptoms. We're going to go more into that in part 2 of this mini-series when we look at the symptoms of fibromyalgia. What I'm trying to get at here is that fibromyalgia and this whole part of the mini-series, what is fibromyalgia, is a really difficult answer. And I'm going to take you to my personal opinions very shortly, which is what this video is mostly going to be about. And the point that I'm trying to currently make is that whilst one person may have one definition for fibromyalgia, one source may have one definition for fibromyalgia, another source may have a completely different definition, or maybe not completely different, but differing in some way. And for that reason, there's still so much to learn about fibromyalgia that for me it's impossible to classify it as a syndrome, a disease, any of those kind of things. For me, we can only say for the time being that it's a condition, because it is a condition that does affect people. But eventually, if we think 10, 15, 20 years down the line, science may have evolved to a point where they can pinpoint exactly what fibromyalgia is. They might even say these people who have previously been diagnosed with fibromyalgia actually have this different thing, which is a completely new different thing, that only have these symptoms, whereas these people have these different symptoms and have this thing which is entirely different again. Who knows what the future is going to bring? Fibromyalgia has over 250 recognised symptoms. Not everybody has over 250 symptoms. In fact, very few people do have over 250 symptoms. But because there is such a wide range of symptoms, at some point there is a feeling that it may be whittled down to being separate types of fibromyalgia, maybe separate conditions, or maybe fibromyalgia A, fibromyalgia B, etc, etc. Who knows what the future brings? The point I'm trying to make is that when asking the question, what is fibromyalgia, it's really difficult to give a concise answer. So as we've just been talking about, from the last 3 slides where we went over all of those sources, we already have an indication of the problem that fibromyalgia causes, and I've just spoken about it for a couple of minutes as well. Using 8 different sources, we have a wide range of descriptions for fibromyalgia. Over the next 4 episodes of this mini-series, we'll be digging deeper into diagnosis, symptoms, treatments, and other varying different parts of fibromyalgia. Fibromyalgia generally combines symptoms of other more easily diagnosed conditions, and it can be confused with many varying other conditions prior to diagnosis, which is why I think in the future potentially we're going to have different scopes of fibromyalgia, possibly. I'm not saying I think that for certain, but I think there's a potential for that to be the case. Let's move on to some examples of what fibromyalgia can be confused for and what often needs to be ruled out before a diagnosis can be undertaken. What is fibromyalgia commonly misdiagnosed as? Hypothyroidism, polymyalgia rheumatica, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, myofascial pain syndromes, hypermobility syndrome, ankylosing spondylitis, and many, many more. And when I say many, many more, I mean many, many more. I don't know an awful lot about very many of these conditions on this slideshow at all. I know a lot about ankylosing spondylitis because that's what my osteopath originally thought I had, so I researched that. I know a bit about polymyalgia rheumatica because I have a family member who suffers from that. But the rest of them, I mean, rheumatoid arthritis, obviously people know about in general, but the rest of them, I don't really know very much about at all. If anybody wants to enlighten us, if anybody watching this video has any of what's on screen right now and wants to share what life living with any of those is like, do feel free to pop a comment down below. It would be really interesting to know. Otherwise, if you do have any interest in understanding more about any of the conditions currently on screen, then I suggest you do Google them if you wish to. So at this point, we are 5 or 6 slides in and we still haven't really answered the question, what is fibromyalgia? So what really is fibromyalgia? Well, as you can already determine from the slides we've been through, this depends on who you ask and, to an extent, what you personally believe. Opinion differs amongst medical professionals, both from the same field of medicine and from different fields of medicine as well. Opinion also differs amongst sufferers of the condition itself. Now, being in several support groups on varying social media platforms, I often see people arguing about what symptoms are part of fibromyalgia and who has fibromyalgia and who doesn't, which isn't particularly helpful at all being a support group. Now, it's important at this point to note that there are plenty of groups out there that are fully supportive and have rules against the above, so it's fully inclusive. You're not allowed to be mean to people, to argue with people. There's even groups out there that promote positive only vibes, which is something we're going to cover in a later video. It will probably be in the treatments video, or depending on how I structure the mini series, there may also be a part on what I personally do to combat fibromyalgia, and it will certainly be in that, if that is the case. Links to supportive groups of this nature that have these rules in place are going to be popped in the description down below, because if there are any sufferers of fibromyalgia watching and you feel like you need some help and support, there are plenty of groups out there that can help and do offer plenty of really good support. So just drop down to the description down below, and if you're on Facebook, there's links to groups on Facebook and varying other groups as well, so do feel free to check those out if you wish to. They're also really helpful, some of these groups. Some of them are for fibromyalgia sufferers only. Some of these groups will accept people who are friends or family of somebody who suffers from fibromyalgia, and those can be a really helpful tool for your friends and family as well, because quite often from the outside, people who know somebody who suffers from fibromyalgia can often have a really difficult time understanding what fibromyalgia is, what the sufferer is feeling, sometimes what they're even talking about, and sometimes it can be really difficult to understand why someone can look perfectly healthy from the outside but feel really rubbish on the inside. Equally, why that person can potentially be, if you're like myself, normal, for want of a better word, 80 to 90% of the time, but then flare up some of the time and be completely a different person. So some of these support groups are really, really handy for friends and family as well. So if you have friends and family and you notice one of these groups allows friends and family to join, feel free to pass those links and those groups along. So as we continue on and with the question of what really is fibromyalgia, obviously at this point you'll be wondering, if the opinions differ so much, how can it be characterised, and how can you possibly making videos like this to try and raise awareness? Well, by citing multiple sources, as we've already done through those first 3 slides, using a general consensus of information and my own knowledge and my own opinion, which the remainder of this video is largely going to focus on. And it's also really important to note that when we do discuss the next few slides and we are talking about my opinion is my opinion. It does not necessarily reflect the opinion of the wider fibromyalgia community, and it does not reflect necessarily the opinion of any medical professional or any of that kind of thing. I'm not a medical professional, I am simply a sufferer of fibromyalgia myself, and I want to share with you my story. I want to raise awareness, and by doing so I do have to use my own opinion in order to construct this video accurately. Which leads us on to the question of, how would I characterise fibromyalgia myself? So how do I characterise fibromyalgia? Well, I personally like to characterise fibromyalgia as a condition that causes widespread pain and fatigue throughout the body, and that is all I like to say. And the reason for that is because whilst there are many other symptoms, and I suffer from many other symptoms personally than just widespread pain and fatigue, those are the 2 symptoms in general that almost all, if not all, fibromyalgia sufferers have in common. Now, I do also recognise, obviously, that fibromyalgia has over 250 listed possible symptoms and therefore cannot possibly be fully characterised by such a simple description. However, a large number of the other symptoms are their own diagnosed condition and formulate many of the symptoms that fibromyalgia sufferers deal with. Examples of this, we've already seen a few, to be fair, from going back a couple of slides to where we had a look at the things that fibromyalgia is commonly misdiagnosed as. But if we think about other types of things, other types of examples, they can include IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. A lot of fibromyalgia sufferers will suffer from IBS, but it's its own condition as well. People can have IBS and not have fibromyalgia, just as fibromyalgia sufferers can have fibromyalgia but not necessarily suffer from the symptom of IBS. Insomnia, another good one. We saw the sources over the first 3 slides, a lot of them citing sleep issues, and migraines as well is one I saw documented reading down a lot of the websites, going through symptoms, which is obviously going to be the next video in this mini series. A lot of them mentioned migraines, which is why that is also on the screen right now. Again, people can be chronic migraine sufferers, but that doesn't mean they have fibromyalgia. Equally, not everybody with fibromyalgia is going to suffer from chronic migraines. Because there are so many symptoms, a large number of which have their own diagnosis, this is why fibromyalgia must be, in my personal opinion, characterised in a simple way, because every sufferer of fibromyalgia will have a unique set of symptoms, but generally speaking, all fibromyalgia sufferers, as I've already stated, will suffer from widespread chronic pain and fatigue. We will, as I've already stated a couple of times, be looking at the various symptoms fibromyalgia sufferers may have to deal with in the next video in the series, in part 2. And as we draw to a close on this video, on part 1, what is fibromyalgia, I hope it has been useful. And just to reflect on what we have learnt in this video so far, the question, what is fibromyalgia, is really difficult to answer. For me, for medical professionals, for other sufferers, yet everyone will have a definition. So any fibromyalgia sufferer out there, you ask them what is fibromyalgia, they will come up with an answer. But if you ask me what my answer would be, I would say it's a condition that causes widespread pain and fatigue and many other symptoms. I have friends who have fibromyalgia. If I ask them for their definition, they would likely come up with something perhaps similar but equally different, because not everybody is going to have that same definition. And that's why it's so difficult for us to answer the question directly, what is fibromyalgia? I'm hoping that by making this video, I've made it somewhat clearer on what fibromyalgia is, even though I'm not able to concisely answer that exact question. I've given you hopefully an idea of what fibromyalgia sufferers deal with, of why it is a really complex condition, and why I'm trying to raise awareness of it as well. If you have enjoyed the video, please leave a like, please pop a comment down below, share it with your friends, and if you're not already subscribed, please feel free to do so if you want to catch parts 2, 3, 4 and 5 of the mini-series and any future content we produce. Following this, I'm going to show you a list of the sources that we used for the definitions, just while I speak for another few moments. This is a list of the sources that we used to provide the 8 definitions we had in the opening 3 slides. If you do want to visit any of these websites, and particularly in the fibromyalgia page for them, I will pop the links to every single one in the description down below. Otherwise though, I hope you have enjoyed this video. I hope I've done a somewhat decent job of trying to explain what fibromyalgia is. Certainly I hope that I've made it clear that it's very, very difficult to explain what fibromyalgia is. And most importantly, do please remember that a lot of this video was purely my opinion and does not necessarily reflect the views of other fibromyalgia sufferers. If anybody in the comments down below does disagree with anything I say, please feel free to do so. And if anybody sees that, please do not react negatively to it, because we want to form opinions and we want to have a valid debate. We don't want nastiness, but if somebody wants to start a debate down below, that is absolutely fine and not a problem. Otherwise though, thank you ever so much for watching part 1 of this mini-series. This has been What is Fibromyalgia with me, Jamie, and this has been Fibromyalgia Fighter. Thank you for watching.